Happy Sabbath. Get this plugged in. And how many of you do get our ministry email updates? Okay, good number of you. We are going to be putting out probably the biggest announcement of our ministry and what we are up to that, man, in years. I don't know how to quantify it, but a big announcement. And if you're not on that email newsletter, I want to encourage you to get the updates. If you just send an email and say, put me on your updates. It's kind of informal, but yeah, just send us an email, beltoftruthministries@gmail.com. And if you just say, you can just put newsletter in the subject heading, and we'll put you on there. You'll get the big update about what's coming. I'm going to leave it as a teaser now because we got a message to do, and I don't want to expend any of the time on that right now. It's primed and ready to go. It's going to be very, very soon, the big announcement. beltoftruthministries@gmail.com. Just send me an email and say newsletter, and we'll put you on the email updates for our ministry. Last night, before we go to Providence and prophecy, if you missed last night, this was kind of the summary statement. And that is, here we are at a religious liberty themed weekend, and we got to get the big picture and the balance right. You remember the name of the message last night? A tightrope of liberty. If we fail to present religious liberty in a balanced way, if we speak only of the papal Rome and the American system speaking like a dragon, but we're failing to speak of the evils of the atheistic regimes and failing to celebrate America's lamb-like founding, then we will have failed to present the whole picture in a balanced way. And that takes the multitude of minds and contributions. One person isn't going to strike it perfectly, but as we collectively pursue the truth together about history, about prophecy, and about religious liberty and the character of God in the context of the great controversy, we will know him more and more. And that's why we're here, aren't we? What a happy Sabbath. To gather together, to ask the Lord's blessing. Ooh, I just slipped into a Thanksgiving hymn there, didn't I? Do you know of Thanksgiving hymns? I grew up in the Christian Reformed Church where we would go to church on Thanksgiving, and around Thanksgiving time, there were a number of hymns that we knew as Thanksgiving hymns. And it's a little fuzzy among some of my Adventist brethren where, Thanksgiving hymns? Some of you get what I'm saying. Name some Thanksgiving hymns for me. We gather together, hymn number 8. Come, ye thankful people, come. Am I stealing the thunder of the song service later? Do they have the whole lineup? Do they have now let all things now living? Do they have we gather together? Do they have brother, sister, parent, child? Come, ye thankful people, come. Here's an interesting one. Thanksgiving, I just put this out on my newsletter yesterday, but I married a Canadian. Where's John? John Record, raised by a Canadian. Any other Canadians? All right, so I married a Canadian, and you guys get it. You get it, okay? Because you're up north, like in Maine, or us in Michigan, we're up north, right? When do we gather our harvest in? Is it like late November? No. Why is American Thanksgiving at the end of November when we're singing Ere the Winter Storms Begin? In the Thanksgiving hymn. Do you remember that line? All is safely gathered in ere the winter storms begin. We gather things in like September in Michigan. So Canadians have their Thanksgiving when? October. Our Columbus Day, yeah. And so I really like that concept. We started doing like a harvest meal in October as a family. And we put it on October 31 because we love the Protestant Reformation. And we despise the worship of demons that occurs on that day in our culture. So we just replace that with kind of moving our Thanksgiving. But I still like to do Thanksgiving during Thanksgiving time. So the second half of the message today is going to be about the pilgrims. But we're going to hone in a little bit more on that last one, celebrating America's lamb-like founding. We're going to look at that today, providence and prophecy. You see, prophecy predicts, providence fulfills. Prophecy foretells, providence fulfills. Where God said the earth would help the woman, we know that's going to happen, and God knows he's going to make it happen. So we're going to see actual providence in history. God's intervention in the founding of this nation, miracle stories that fulfill Revelation 12 and Revelation 13. But before we say another word, let's begin with prayer. Here we are to ask the Lord's blessing of his presence. Father in heaven, thank you so much for your word, and that when we study prophecy, we see your hand in history fulfilling it. We know you are the living God. You are active, you are involved, and it is observable, and we can study it and give you glory and praise and spread the good news to others of a soon coming Savior. We thank you for all the prophecies fulfilled that show us that the remaining ones are yet to be fulfilled, and we can have that blessed hope of Jesus soon coming. So as we look at this again, we want to look at your character and face, Lord. We want to see Jesus through this study. And so please be with us in our midst and fill our minds with truth and love. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, you remember 1976? How many of you remember 1976? Okay, I don't. I was born in 1980, so I don't remember, but I got the coins. They minted the special coins, the bicentennial coins. And I heard they had after-school specials on television and parades and celebratory atmosphere in 1976. Why? Because it was the bicentennial of 1776, the Declaration of Independence. Well, another big anniversary happened just a few years ago. It was the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower voyage and the Pilgrims coming to this land in 1620. Now, the irony of this was that it was the first independent Protestant worship services held in this land. Jamestown had happened. That was Anglican. That was more tied to the Crown and the Church of England. But the second group of British colonists to arrive in America were the Pilgrims in 1620, and they were separatists. They were not of the Church of England. So they were independent. The first ever independent Protestant worship services happened in 1620. Now, the anniversary of that 300 years later was not really celebrated intentionally, but it happened to fall on 1920 that Prohibition occurred. Alcohol, the scourge of alcohol, was significantly diminished in America through Prohibition, the constitutional amendment. Fast forward another 100 years. The 400-year anniversary of the Pilgrims. What was going on? Yeah, the liquor stores were open, but the churches were closed. Alcohol consumption and the sale thereof was deemed essential labor. Going to church, non-essential. What a tragedy. What a shame. And there were no after-school specials and parades or anybody mentioning it even. Nobody talked about it. 2021 came around. I said, I need to do something about this. I had the privilege to present a 10-part series at Amazing Facts on Bible prophecy in the spring of 2021. And we didn't quite finish all the prophecies in 10 parts. I was like, there are a few more, and this happens to be the 400th year anniversary of the first Thanksgiving, the year after the Pilgrims arrived. Maybe we should do like a Thanksgiving theme thing. They were like, yeah, we love that. That sounds like a great idea. So I got to present on what we are studying the second half of the message today, the Pilgrims. And actually, some of this stuff from the first half is also a part of the weekend that we got to do there at Amazing Facts. So it's going to be repeated and enlarged upon today. And the study from yesterday is the same study from today. You had verses 5 and 6 where the woman flees into the wilderness. And in verses 13 and 14, she flees for 1,260 days, given great wings of an eagle. And then the Lord protects her for a time and times and half a time, the woman being the church. And then the key term, the key phrase occurs, the earth helped the woman. And you decode what that means simply by seeing what the opposite of earth represents in Bible prophecy, and that is waters represent peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. Lots of people, the old world where the empires of old had arisen. And then the earth would be the opposite of that, a less densely populated place or a more sparsely populated place that was to help the woman. So the new world being a place that would be a haven of refuge for the persecuted church. This is a quick summary of a very important study in prophecy. In Revelation 13, of course, it's lamb-like in its qualities. A lamb-like nation was to arise that would preserve religious and civil liberty. Now, we're going to study two different phases today. We're going to look at the founding generation again, and this time we're going to look at the stories of mostly the War for Independence, but also a little bit at the War of 1812 and prior to the War of Independence. And then we're going to pivot to the Pilgrims of 1620. So we're going to do Founders first, Pilgrims second. They're all covered in the Great Controversy, chapter 16. It's a recommended reading for everybody. Now, do you remember from your history textbooks the 7 Years' War? This was before there was an independent America. There were British colonies on the eastern seaboard, and the British and the French were waging basically a world war over their colonial empires. It was a 7 Years' War. There was a British colonel, you might know his name, George Washington, 22 years old, British colonel fighting against the French. Americans may have called this the French and Indian War in their textbooks. Same war, just the North American theater of it. Well, he's the only officer that survived this key battle against the French. Here was his own words that he stated about it in 1755. I have been protected beyond all human probability or expectation. The British got annihilated in this battle. But George Washington, the sole surviving officer from that battle, he says it's beyond human probability. What is the name of this message? Providence and prophecy. He says, for I had 4 bullets through my coat and 2 horses shot under me, yet escaped unhurt, although death was leveling my companions on every side of me. Does anybody want to do some math, some probability? When you're wearing a coat and on a horse, especially the coat, what are the chances with bullets going everywhere? 4 bullets go through the coat, 2 through horses, and 0 touch you. This is beyond all human probability. I mean, how much fabric is there on a coat versus body? That's amazing. By the way, if you read in the book Gospel Workers, it speaks affirmatively of George Washington, a complimentary way. So when we look to founding fathers with some sort of, agenda that the history profession so often brings, like we mentioned 1619 Project yesterday, these were all racist, slave-owning, evil men, and all of this kind of revisionist history. It's not stated that way in the Spirit of Prophecy about George Washington. In Gospel Workers, it speaks of his work ethic and doing everything with system, and that's an admirable quality that President Washington had. Well, he's not president yet in our story, but so far the story is going well, yes? Now, why, by the way, would Providence be interested in preserving the life of George Washington? Because he's going to be the key player in the War for Independence that is going to be the founding of this country to fulfill the prophecy about America rising as a land-like nation. Let's go to the War for Independence now. This is the first naval engagement, the Battle of Bunker Hill, 1775. The British Navy at this time was the most powerful navy in the world against a ragtag bunch of colonial fighters in the Continental Army. This is no contest by any human calculation, at least. The most powerful military power on the globe. By the way, the British did preserve the colonies in the French and Indian War and in the 7 Years' War. And even though it seemed the French were to win, there were other interventions as well. I'm skipping other miracle stories, by the way, the French and Indian War. And you might say, okay, so God was weighing in on the side of the British. Does that make the British like the holy empire of God? Well, no, you're going to see it goes the opposite here and against the British, because there's an interest in fulfilling prophecy. It's not the good guys and the bad guys. What religion was France at this time? France was Catholic. So if you're going to have a Protestant nation that's lamb-like, it had better be British colonies that are preserved, not French colonies where there's Catholic domination. So historians, though, say that it was coincidence that in this important opening battle, the British ships were stocked with the wrong size cannonballs, and they couldn't bombard the American position or the city of Boston, which they had intended to do. And so 2,300 British soldiers had to disembark and charge the hill, and they suffered twice as many casualties as the Americans. So this gave some confidence to the cause of independence. Another time in the war, by the way, the British held siege against the colonists in Boston. If you know anything about the history of warfare, siege is a brutal form of total war against civilian populations, starving out the inhabitants. And British General Howe planned 3,000 troops to charge Dorchester Heights, but before he could, has anybody been there, by the way? Have you seen these sites? Yeah. Before he could, just like would happen later in the War of 1812, as we're going to see, a violent storm caused turbulent seas and prevented the landing of the 3,000 troops, so that George Washington called it, he said that this most remarkable interposition of providence is for some wise purpose. I have no doubt. He knows it's providence. By the way, was George Washington then a deist? Oh, there are so many. This is such an interesting conversation. What was the religion of the founding fathers? Could have a whole separate message on that. We won't do it, but I did a deep dive into this even before I was Adventist. 20 years ago, I was teaching an evangelical Christian school that were more dominion theology minded, and the founding fathers were, evangelical Christians, and they meant to, create a Christian nation that to be, although the laws of the land should all be enforced Christianity kind of mindset. And as I looked into it, you got the debate. Like, they were deists, they were, totally not Bible believing Christians, or they were totally Christians, believing in everything we believe. And I found both to be false, which is not a surprise, because when there are warring agendas, the secularist agenda, the dominion right agenda, you're going to find a misconstruing of history on both sides. And I did find that. When you look at the 5 key founders, you look at Washington, Madison, Jefferson, Adams, and Washington, Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin. Each of them would have believed in providence, but also were not entirely orthodox in their Christian beliefs and practices as we believe. People are aware of Jefferson, but even the others, Jefferson and Adams, wrote letters to one another about doubts they had about Christian doctrine. And Adams himself, being a Congregationalist from Massachusetts, that was not something he was doing quite as publicly as Jefferson. But anyway, they believed in providence. They were not deists. They understood God was involved in weighing in because providence will fulfill prophecy. Yes? New York was the next target of the British. British planned the largest land invasion force in history up till that point. They said, we're going to land 32,000 troops on 400 ships. There are masts like tree trunks in New York Harbor. And Washington said, we are not prepared for it. We are not in men or in arms prepared for it, but providence will still go on to afford us aid. The date is July 9, 1776. The Declaration of Independence, of course, has just been signed how many days before? 5 days before, on July 4. A copy of the Declaration of Independence is brought to Washington and to his troops. He has it read to his troops in the following words, especially emphasizing his own statement. What's in there? We saw it yesterday. With a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Now, I want to be clear, just like the British weren't the army of God in the Old Testament sense, neither are the Americans here. God is weighing in and intervening at times to fulfill his purposes. In fact, during the Civil War, you're aware that in the spirit of prophecy, it shows that God intervened to punish the North. And actually, they could have won a battle, but he intervened and had them do a precipitous retreat that historians look at it like, why did they all retreat? Like, well, an angel came and went like this. Like, you find that. I don't have the reference. I didn't plan to mention that. If anybody has the reference, mention it so I can tell people where they can find that. It's an amazing account. So God intervenes, even sometimes, and to teach a lesson in that sense. But here you find him fulfilling a purpose, to fulfill prophecy and create a land of liberty. We saw Constantine. He was of the mindset, in this sign ye shall conquer. We don't understand that is biblical from the New Testament. God's covenant in the New Testament is with the church, not with empires and nations. And it's with all believers of all nations. It is a people group that is not modern Israel, founded in 1948, not ancient Israel, and not a nation of any kind. Though Constantine thought that church and military should unite, the New Testament was betrayed in that move by Constantine. However, when God says something will happen in prophecy, he's going to make it happen in providence, and he will use his power. And that grand old document recognized that it's providence that's being involved here. 10,000 British troops are landed elsewhere to come from behind and trap the Continental Army between this largest invasion force in history and the sea. An urgent retreat is needed across the East River, which is notably calm at the time. And so the history records this amazing retreat of Washington soldiers across the East River by night. Now, where the British ships were, The waters were boisterous, but the river was calm. Half of Washington's forces are able to escape by night. Now, how many did I say? Half. That's not good enough because they're about to lose half of their forces to this brilliant and overwhelming British assault. But here's the miracle. A thick fog, an especially thick fog, rests upon the area in the morning to sort of extend the shroud of darkness a few hours, just long enough for them to retreat. A very dense fog, said Ben Talmadge, Washington's chief of intelligence, seemed to settle in a peculiar manner over both encampments. I could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards distance. George Washington was the last on the boat. The British never again had the opportunity to capture the entire Continental Army all at once. That's awesome. So the Battle of Saratoga was one of the most important battles in world history. It's known as the turning point of the Revolutionary War. You might remember that from your history textbooks. Why is it considered such an important battle, the Battle of Saratoga? Elihu Yale puts it this way. He says, "To whom but the ruler of the winds shall we ascribe it that the British reinforcement in the summer of 1777 was delayed on the ocean 3 months by contrary winds until it was too late?" So their reinforcements that would have overwhelmed the American colonists did not arrive till it was too late because of contrary winds. And writers and thinkers of the time said, this is clearly the ruler of the winds getting involved again. And the Battle of Saratoga was a signal stroke of Providence, according to George Washington. The fact that America won that battle, it was against all odds once again. And so you start adding up the probability of these. Have you ever multiplied fractions and see how big those numbers get really, really fast? The chances of one in 1,000 event happening is very slim. The chances of 10 of them happening is impossible, nearly impossible. It's Providence involved. Now, this tipped the scales in the war because now the French see that their old adversary, the British, are in a world of hurt, and actually maybe these American colonists can actually defeat our adversary. So the French get involved in the war on the side of the Americans. How things turn. You see, that's why you can't make alliances and yoke together with this group or that nation or that empire. It's God's will. He will intervene. He will use anything or anybody that he pleases, even the Catholic French Empire. You just have to pause, by the way, as you think about how much sacrifice people have made for the cause of freedom. Those who put it all on the line in this war for independence. I was thinking back to when it said we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. That is bold and courageous and self-sacrificing. And they went through incredible pain, suffering, sorrow. Have you ever heard of the British starving ships? When they took American prisoners of war, they didn't treat them humanely. They put them on starving ships, and that is literally what it sounds like. They would just put them on ships and not feed them and starve them to death. 12,400 Americans were put on starving ships. 11,000 of them died. 11,000 out of the 12,400. That's like a 90% casualty rate, and that's more than twice as many Americans as were killed in battle. 11,000 killed on the starving ships. There's Valley Forge. Another 11,000 soldiers died in December in the freezing temperatures of Valley Forge. 2,500 died. There were 11,000 there, but about a quarter of them died. Limbs were black and amputated. They were unified from every state, diversity of states, many different kinds of cultures and faiths in these states that came together to fight the British Empire. People of even minority races, blacks and Native Americans, fighting in this cause as well. Well, the final act and defeat was the Battle of Cowpens, the pursuit of the Americans that the British made after the fleeing of the Americans, the retreat, is really an amazing story. General Cornwallis of the British pursued the Continental Army at their retreat, and they were estimated to be 2 hours behind the Americans, pursuing them. The Americans cross a river called the Catawba River. At that time, a sudden storm raises the waters of that river, and the British following now have a bigger river and a faster flowing river to cross, and it takes them a little longer to get across. Now they're further behind. The Americans come to the Dan River. Same thing happens. Storm, rain, rivers rise after the Americans cross. The British come to it. They're even further behind now. Now, the British commander, Henry Clinton, said, "Here the Royal Army was again stopped by a sudden rise of the waters, which had only just fallen, almost miraculously, to let the enemy over." Oh man, we could go on and on with these. We have other things to do this morning, but I like summing up Washington's statement here. We have abundant reasons to thank Providence for its many favorable interpositions on our behalf. It has, at times, been my only dependence, for all other resources seem to have failed us. That's wonderful reminder of God's involvement in the affairs of even worldly settings like, oh, I forgot this, 1812. We got to get to the Pilgrims. We're going to get to the Pilgrims, and there's a little interlude between this and the Pilgrims, so we got a lot to cover, but I got to throw this in there, the War of 1812. Remember, the United States had gained independence from the British in 1781, and then we formed our nation under the Articles of Confederation, which lasted to 1787. Constitution is ratified in 87. You get the Bill of Rights in 1791. So we've got an America. We've got independence. We've got liberty. But the British in 1812 are impressing American soldiers through their navy, saying sailors rather, like Joseph Bates. You've heard the stories. Hopefully, if you've never read the autobiography of Joseph Bates, read it, or read the children's version, Cabin Boy to Advent Crusader. Great books. And they're just enslaving Americans. And we go to war with the British in 1812. They come back. They're like, okay, we're going to teach you a lesson. And here's how it goes. They set the White House on fire. A number of buildings in D.C. are on fire. But a great storm arose, and a fierce tornado fell upon the British upon their march in D.C., killing many of their soldiers. The British fled the city. Torrential rains for hours extinguished the fires, and the British had to make it out through mud and downed trees, with 2 ships run aground and others having damaged rigging. So the Lord shall fight for you, and you shall hold your peace. The British Navy was also outside Baltimore. This is the famous one. The flag was still there, Francis Scott Key. They're going to bombard the city of Baltimore, but the storm that had ravaged D.C. with rain took a turn down to Baltimore, and the cannonballs land in mud and don't do the damage they're supposed to do. And that's where the famous hymn was written, famous American national anthem, Francis Scott Key. So I wanted to do a little interlude here because we're telling some amazing war stories, and I want to give a nod to and speak to also the even higher principle of non-combatant service that is a part of our tradition, which I just value so much. I'm reading A Thousand Shall Fall to my kids again because it's just it just deserves to be read over and over. The stories of Desmond Doss, of course, those have even been recognized by the broader culture and people who watch movies. But it's very important to honor the service of those who served in combatant roles. It's very important to honor the service of those who served their country. And every individual, it's important that we follow our conscience when it comes to this question of bearing arms. Should we partake? Should we participate or not? There will be many people in heaven on both sides of that question, I believe. Old Testament saints to begin with, right? And so, wonderful tradition. I'm going to actually share a little bit vindicating this viewpoint, but I want to preface it with making sure we have a balanced way that we talk about these things. And the Old Testament saints, the Waldenses who push rocks over on their enemies, they're going to be in heaven, yes? And they had different convictions than some of us do. And so it's important to be led by God in our study of this and in our practice of this important question. I want to start also with mentioning that though I'm going to present just for a couple of minutes on this viewpoint, I also am a Second Amendment enthusiast. Now, you might find that to be strange that these are bedfellows here, but I will tell you I am a Second Amendment enthusiast, not in the sense of using weapons to go kill a bunch of people, but there are many reasons to admire and appreciate and defend the Second Amendment. That could be a longer lesson of constitutional history and the nature of governments and citizenry. But the easiest way to amplify the importance of the Second Amendment in a quick comment is just simply this. It's in the Constitution, and the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And so if we maybe put out like church statements out there that are condemning certain classes of firearms, we're actually going contrary to the Bible, because Romans 13 says to obey and submit yourself to the governing authorities. What is the highest governing authority in America? The Constitution. The Constitution is what governs the governors. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. In America, we have a rule of law system, not a rule of man system. And so with the supreme law of the land saying that this shall not be infringed, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, that is a legal contract, the supreme law of the land. That is the government that we must submit to in this country, and not put out statements saying we think this kind of class of firearms ought to be banned. You can have that private opinion, but if you're publicly really being seditious and against Romans 13, against the law of the land, that would be a little bit of a problem. That has been done, if you're wondering. What is he talking about if we put out statements? There's all kinds of statements. Maybe that's for a separate study, but I want to show Romans 12 and 13 side by side. Have you ever looked at these two chapters side by side and noticed that they're kind of in contrast? Romans 12 is about the church. It talks about brotherly love, preferring one another. It talks about blessing even those who persecute us. It talks about not avenging ourselves, but remembering God says, vengeance is his and he will repay. It says if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him drink, and that we should overcome evil with good. Now, Romans 13 is a little different. The principles here are principles of loving the enemy, giving food and drink to the enemy, blessing those who persecute, not taking vengeance upon ourselves, but leaving that to God. Romans 13, however, talks about an entity, not the church, but an entity that is properly bearing the sword as a terror to those who do evil. He beareth the sword, and he is a revenger to execute wrath. Do you see the difference between the methods that the church has been given versus the methods that the state has been given? This is why many take a non-combatant position when it comes to this sticky question, because that's our marching orders on the left as the church, and the New Testament church is never called to become the state and to adopt its methods. In fact, Paul says in Romans 12, not to be conformed to the world. That's not to take away the prerogative of the state to exercise its proper role of ministering vengeance on the wrongdoer. It's just that we aren't called to do that in Romans 12. That's to be left to the state. Jesus put it this way. When Paul said, don't be conformed to this world, but instead, if your enemy is hungry, feed him, and if he's thirsty, give him something to drink, and bless those who persecute you. Jesus said, not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight. So Romans 12, be not conformed to this world. John 18, my kingdom is not of this world. Worldly kingdoms fight. Our kingdom does things differently. In fact, this contrast is seen in Revelation also. And interestingly, it's chapter 12 and 13. What did we just see? The church, the state, Romans 12 and 13. The church in Romans 12, the woman, the state in Revelation 13, except the difference in Revelation is this is the rogue state. Romans 13 is the properly constituted state. Revelation 13 is the state gone rogue, imposing worship and the mark of the beast. Here are a few more texts on this question. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. NIV translates that as we do not wage war as the world does. This is where some get these kinds of convictions from. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. We use different weapons than the world. Our weapons are mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. Jesus put it this way, put up again thy sword into his place, for all they that take the sword shall perish with the sword. And as you read through the New Testament, there is not a single time that Christians use violence for any reason unrebuked. This is the time where Peter took the sword out and was rebuked, and the church never took it up again. But Brother Scott, violence is all throughout the Old Testament, sanctioned by God, so why should we not also use the same methods? Do you remember Jesus teaching on divorce? Do you remember it was such a high standard he set for marriage and divorce questions that the disciples were just like, well, you might as well not even get married then. You remember that conversation in Matthew 19? Jesus said something very interesting because it begged the question. And they were like, well, if you're saying it this way, then why did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? Do you remember Jesus' answer? He says, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. He's like, there's actually a higher standard that I'm here to tell you about. Let's take it all the way back to the beginning. Yes, in the Old Testament time, There were wars. There were laws. Many times that God was just meeting people where they were at after 400 years of darkness and Egyptian bondage during very dark and brutal times, leading progress as the light shines ever brighter unto the perfect day. Truth and our appreciation and ability to appreciate truth grows over time. And so God meets people where they're at. Like when there were avengers of blood in the Old Testament. Do you remember that? Do you think God wants avengers of blood running around hunting people down with vigilante justice? Well, of course not. In the Old Testament times, he did not choose to say, we are eliminating avengers of blood. No more avenger of blood culture in Israel. They weren't ready for that, apparently. He said, here's cities of refuge for you to do your avenger of blood thing. You remember the kings? He knew that they were going to ask for kings. He didn't want them to have a king. He did not want them to have a king at all. But he knew that's where they're at. So I'm going to give you specific instructions on how to have a king in the least bad way as possible. He's meeting them where they're at and then growing our understanding on through into the New Testament. Deuteronomy 17 is where you find that about kings. Same thing with divorce. Because of the hardness of your hearts, I told you this, and now I'm growing you into that. You see the principle I was doing here? We're extending that principle further into a brighter light. Let's use light as an analogy. If you've been living in a cave for a year, and somebody's like, I'm going to show you the light. There's something wonderful and good out there, and they drag you out into the middle of the noonday sun, you're going to be not able to handle that and run right back into your cave, right? But what if you're brought out at daybreak? And it's just a little bit of light. And then the rising sun shines ever brighter unto the perfect day, yes? Like this guy, I think his standard and principle was so elevated and beautiful. There's a reason why we tell and retell his story. His name is Dirk Willems, 1569. He had accepted the Anabaptist faith and was rebaptized, believer's baptism, which was a crime in the Netherlands and through most of Europe to be an Anabaptist. To be rebaptized, and in Switzerland, you were given the third baptism. The third baptism meaning drowning, death by drowning, if you were an Anabaptist. Well, he was imprisoned for his crime of accepting the Anabaptist faith and being baptized. But he found a way to escape by tying some rags together and getting out the window. So he's running away. Well, there's a moat, a pond outside of the tower that he had escaped from. But it's winter and it's iced over. And he's able to get across without falling through. But he sees the guard now has noticed him and is chasing him across. The guard, a little heavier than Dirk, maybe had been eating better than him in his imprisoned condition. The guard falls through. His enemy is now drowning in the icy waters. This is the big test for Dirk Willems. Do I follow, love your enemy, bless those who persecute you? Do I do good to him, or do I save my own hide? He did the Christ-like thing. He turned around. He saved his enemy, his pursuer. And he was recaptured. And he knew what he was getting into because a bunch of people in his very same situation had been burned at the stake just that year. He knew what he was doing, but he gave his life as a witness for the gospel of Christ in action. And there's a reason why his story is so inspiring to us. We're still telling and retelling it 500 years later nearly. It's in the book Martyr's Mirror, by the way. This is the most famous picture of the Anabaptist version of Fox's Book of Martyrs. It ought to be reading for children and those who appreciate history to understand this amazing group of people, the Anabaptists. So it's the law of love. That is the great law of the universe, yes? But are there exceptions to the rule where actually using some degree of force is actually the loving thing to do? You got to be nuanced with some of these things. Is there a situation where using some force, maybe some kind of restraint, is actually the loving thing to do? How about here? The man is about to annihilate himself and everybody around him, and to protect him from himself, the loving thing to do is to bind him down with a straitjacket so he can do no more harm. That is actually caring about his well-being, and it takes some force to get there. You're not ending his life. You're not ending his probation by just killing him, but you got to have enough nuance to be able to be flexible on how to apply the principle. Never compromise principle, but be wise and be prudent and be intelligent in unique situations, recognizing sometimes there is an exception to the rule. How about it? Self-defense. Is self-defense a human right? Of course it is. It is. We are endowed by our Creator with our right to life. So any individual has a human right to practice self-defense. Even in the Old Testament times, you weren't even considered guilty of bloodshed if you killed a man if he was invading your house as an intruder at night. Isn't that interesting? Not guilty of bloodshed. But I want everybody listening, online or here, in our own walk with the Lord, to pray about this. If it's a survival of the fittest mindset, self-defense, it may be a human right. It's a kill or be killed situation. It is every human right necessarily the most high principle to live by. There are things that you have a right to do that if you do may not actually be the best. Now that's not a condemnation of somebody who has a different conviction on that matter, but maybe this is like food sacrifice to idols. We all have to take our convictions to the Lord and allow Him to refine them. And would I be the next Dirk Willems? Something may be lawful for us, but still not reaching our highest calling of all. But how about in defense of the weak? At risk to yourself. Is that a higher principle than self-defense? Is defending the weak and putting your own self and life on the line a higher principle than self-defense? It certainly is, because it's not about protecting myself. Jesus was given that temptation on the cross and overcame in my behalf. Come down now from the cross and save yourself. But pivoting from self-defense in that question, defending the weak is a 100% different, totally different principle than survival of the fittest, kill or be killed self-defense. Now, am I saying I want to take somebody else's life and end their probation in order to defend the weak? No, I want everybody to be saved. But I do take seriously the term that I read in the book Adventist Home, that as a husband, I am called to be the protector of my wife. The protector. As the husband, God has given men a responsibility, and the Bible calls the woman the weaker vessel. And that doesn't mean weaker spiritually or weaker, and it just means weaker physically. And the mother is the highest calling of all. An angel cannot ask for a higher mission, it says in the Spirit of Prophecy. But I've had at least two opportunities, you might say responsibilities, to engage in a confrontation with somebody. And I don't mean attacking, I don't mean getting into a fight, but there have been occasions where I personally have had to give some tough love to somebody in defense of my wife. And it's not like I'm going out looking for these things, but things happen in this fallen world, and God has given the husband that responsibility. There was a father who took his kids and family camping. They had the truck, they had the camper, they were towing. They're out west where campgrounds are hours apart sometimes. They finally find when it's the end of the day, all right, we got to go to sleep. Can't go another mile. But the campground is deserted. The campground host comes to him and says, now you don't want to camp here. There are some crazy gang members that have been coming around harassing people on their motorbikes, and the whole campground just evacuated and fled because of these crazy guys. The dad says, well, we're going to trust this to the Lord. We're going to just stay because we can't drive another so many more hours. So they don't see the bikers around. They pitch camp. They are getting ready, going for a little walk before bed. Mom and dad are going for a little walk. The girls are getting ready, and his daughters are getting ready in the camper. And then dad hears the bikers revving and coming toward the campground. He hustles back. As they're approaching, he's approaching, just walking, one man versus all these men, violent men. What are you going to do? Well, what he does is he walks up and does what a father ought to do. He speaks authoritatively. And he just, as a Christian, as a believer in prayer, knowing that the Lord is with him, he confronts them and he says, can I help you, gentlemen? And all of these rough, hardened criminals look at him with eyes like saucers and jaws wide open, and they get on their bikes and flee. You see, God's given us our role, we do our part, and the angel of the Lord encampeth round about them that fear him. Okay, that was a good interlude, but we got to get to the pilgrims. Hopefully you're seeing nuance here and principle and growing light. Story of the Pilgrims. Bible says, or the Spirit of Prophecy says, we have nothing to fear lest we forget how God has led us in our past history. And that's applying to church history and to Adventist history. But I want to go further back to the 1620s. The beginnings of America were actually not forged in 1776. They started way back here with these fearless pilgrims. These were British citizens who were poor outcasts, who were enemies of the state in Great Britain. They were considered of a dissident faith, being separatists. They were not authorized. Hebrews 11 refers to those who are not worthy, of whom this world was not worthy. The world's not worthy of them. And these persecuted ones ended up having more influence on the formation of America than all of the empires that fought to carve up the Americas combined, because of the principles they brought to this country. 51 pilgrims, just 51 of them, established many of the principles of what would become the foundation of the American Republic. And from 51 pilgrims descend 34 million people. Anybody a descendant of the Mayflower? I knew there would be. I was going to say there's going to be 2 or 3. I think I saw 4 hands because I'm in New England. There's more than normal. That's so neat. I'm not descended from the Pilgrims with blood lineage, as most of you aren't, but I think we can all say we are descended spiritually from them, of every race and nation. Ironically, the guy who's celebrating the Pilgrims is of Dutch lineage, and it was the Netherlands that the Pilgrims were trying to get away from when they came to America. So that's why it's ironic, because they didn't like my people very much. That's okay. I don't hold it against them. But how about this one? I learned this in middle school. The black poet Langston Hughes, I too can sing America. Isn't that wonderful how inclusive this country is to people of all faiths, races, nations, and backgrounds? It is principles of individual liberty that are for all of humanity. We are all created equal. And I had to memorize that one in middle school. We were taught history. Kids need to learn history these days, correct history. Can I take you back to the late 1500s when the separatist movement was underway? There was a congregation worshiping under William Brewster. He was the separatist pastor holding illegal worship services under the nose of the British Crown and the Church of England. His young apprentice was William Bradford, who ended up being the governor of Plymouth Colony, Plymouth Plantation, and wrote the history, the chronicled the account of the Pilgrims. And so he's a very important, these are the 2 key figures in the story of the Pilgrims. But he was an orphan boy, a sickly boy, taken under the wing of Elder Brewster. And he was given his own copy of the Bible in English, how he cherished that and how he and Brewster pored over its pages together and studied God's word and grew in their faith. And as sincere students of the Bible, these members of this congregation in Scrooby were not satisfied with the Anglican Church. The Church of England was quasi-Protestant at best. It was far too Catholic in its trappings. It never was a principled break from Rome. It was King Henry VIII wanting to marry many wives and had not the Pope's permission. The real reformers in England were the separatists, and you could say the Puritans as well. But the separatists were the most radical of all. The Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England. They had no problem with a state church. They just wanted it to be more Protestant. The separatists said, this state church is beyond repair. We're going to just separate like the Anabaptists are doing over there, and we're going to be a nonconformist religious group. The separatists insisted on their independence, and most of New England is going to end up being populated by Puritans. They were much larger in number, and so making this distinction between the separatists and the Puritans is important, because the Puritans, for lovers of religious liberty, the Puritans do get some well-deserved bad ink. But the separatists were a different group. Those on the Mayflower were not Puritans, they were separatists and didn't have quite that same level of religious intolerance. So Brewster actually came from a prominent family and could have easily just made his life very, very convenient and and non-threatening. But according to his convictions, he was holding these worship services, and they started getting noticed by the authorities. And so what they did was they said, we're going to escape to the Netherlands as a congregation. We know there are other separatists under there worshiping under John Robinson, and we want to go join them. And so the first attempt to leave was a disaster. The captain betrayed them, stole their possessions, and many of these members of the Scrooby congregation ended up in jail. The second attempt, 80 passengers boarded a coal barge, and then they were to be transferred to a Dutch ship. So it was to try to be a little more incognito that way. But again, the king's officers caught them, arrested them. Women and children were imprisoned this time. These are committed, principled people. Finally, the third attempt, those that remained, did make it over to Leiden in the Netherlands there. You can see in Holland. They made it and worshiped under Pastor John Robinson. And you'll want to remember him, a very important guy who made statements about, now when you're going to the New World, follow every ray of light that you see from God's word. Don't stick with Calvin like the Calvinists do 100 years later. Don't stick with Luther like the Lutherans did 100 years later. Don't stick with me. Just follow me as far as I've taught you, and then continue to follow the Lord. It's growing ever brighter unto the perfect day. Well, they got to do printing and evangelism there. They were doing English tracts and sending them back to England. Well, all of a sudden, the authorities in England are finding these seditious papers floating around, and they track them back to Leiden. They come and dismantle the press that these pilgrims had been working so hard to disseminate their truth with, and we're being found out even here. Now, they did not get William Brewster because he was back in England. That's funny. Switch spots there. What was he doing in England? Well, Leiden was not a long-term home for them. They were not really assimilating into Dutch culture and didn't want to be. They wanted to preserve their Englishness, their distinctness. Their children were starting to be absorbed into that worldly culture that they felt. And so they said, okay, we need to find another place to go, to escape to practice our religion freely. The year was 1617. Now, I want you to remember that year, because this is a key year where they make the decision to go. They don't end up going till 1620, but 1617 is when they decide. And the way they decide is they hold a day of prayer and fasting, and then they hold a vote. Will we go where those Jamestown colonists have gone, where that lost colony of Roanoke had gone, and they went searching for gold and all died? We've heard about this America. We don't know much about it. All we know is there are saber-toothed tigers there, two-headed snakes, and Indians that boil people alive and eat their skin. They had heard some rumors. So now, with that in mind, with the craziness of what America was at the time, this wilderness, you'd think there's no way anybody's going to go there. Take their families there? It's a dangerous place. But William Bradford, now a young man, stands up and says, all great and honorable actions are accompanied with great difficulties, and must be both enterprised and overcome with answerable courages. That's awesome, isn't it? The difficulties must be met with equal level of courage. It was granted. Dangers were great. He's speaking, looking back now. Great dangers were great, but not desperate. The difficulties were many, but not invincible. It might be that many of the things feared might never befall. Others, by provident care, other things feared might, by provident care and the use of good means, might in great measure be prevented. And all of these dangers, through the help of God, by fortitude and patience, might be either borne or overcome. Now, when he gives that speech in the assembly of pilgrims, who's going to say, shrink back in fear? No way. Caleb's and Joshua's across the whole congregation vote in favor. To the unknown wilderness we will go, because God has bidden. In fact, it said in the great controversy that God's hand seemed pointing them across the sea to a land where they might found for themselves a state and leave to their children the precious heritage of religious liberty. They went forward without shrinking in the path of providence. God's hand was pointing them, and it was his providence. They knew God was leading. They didn't know the prophecy they were fulfilling, but they knew God was leading. George Washington didn't know the prophecy he was fulfilling, but God moves people. So they sold their property, and they were literally moved across the ocean. They're going to get on 2 ships, the Speedwell and the Mayflower, to be taken to fruitful Virginia. Now others not of their faith were also on board. They were called the strangers, meaning they were not of the Pilgrims' separatist faith. The Speedwell is going to meet up in the Netherlands with the Mayflower from the Netherlands and meet up with the Mayflower in England. And as they're being commissioned by their pastor, this is a famous painting. This is in the Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C. It's a very important event in the history of this country. Robinson's been called the most important pilgrim that never made the pilgrimage to America. He never made the voyage because he died in 1625 before he had a chance to join them. Well, it was a relief when the two ships finally embarked upon the journey because they knew the bishop's spies, the king's soldiers, could arrest them at any time if they don't get moving. But soon after departure, the Speedwell puts out distress signals because it's taking on water. It's leaking badly. They make for the nearest port. They mend the leaks as quickly as they can, and they head off a second time. Now they're 300 miles into the Atlantic Ocean, several days into the journey. Distress signals again. The Speedwell is not seaworthy, the captain says, so they have to leave it behind. Now there's not room for everybody. Dorothy Bradford, the wife of William Bradford, is overwhelmed with sorrow at this point, but William gives words of courage. He says, "It is not with us as with other men, whom small things can discourage, or small discontentments cause to wish themselves at home again." Don't you wish you could put that on a t-shirt or a social media meme? It's probably too long for today's attention span, but that short little statement ought to be our life motto. Don't be discouraged. In fact, what did he say? We shouldn't wish ourselves at home again. What is home to a pilgrim? What is home to a pilgrim? This world is not our home. So Dorothy had reason to be concerned, though, because there are 2 months delayed. They're heading into the autumn months when the weather turns worse. Their food rations are down. They're leaving on September 6th. That has them arriving in almost winter. One of the pilgrims, Robert Cushman, who was the one that arranged for their business transactions, was noted as saying it's going to be only by a miracle that this is actually going to happen. So they're down to one ship. Many parents leave their children in the care of other parents to make sure they can make the voyage. So it's a disproportionately high number of children. It's all families pretty much on the Mayflower. 102 pack onto this ship. 30 of them are children and youth. If you go to the Mayflower replica today, the insurance companies made sure that they had 7 foot, instead of 5 foot. You can walk through and the below, down below level, but it was actually like this, not very comfortable. Morning and evening, though, the pilgrims worshipped and knelt in prayer. They listened to Bible stories of God's providence on troubled seas and through the waters, as the threatening autumn gales blew out of the west and the ship rose and fell on mountains of water. Bradford said the ship was wickedly shaken, wickedly indeed. Quite literally, water is being sent by the serpents to try to prevent the woman from being helped by the earth in this case. They sang their psalms, and that gave them encouragement, but the worldly ship crew didn't like it one bit. And one member of the crew threatened to throw half of them overboard if they didn't shut their mouths. Well, interestingly, he was one of only 2 to be cast overboard during that voyage. The second one, sadly, was when they had arrived, and it was Dorothy Bradford. She fell into the waters and perished. To these pilgrims, liberty and obedience to God's leading was the highest value in life, at the risk to life itself. In one dramatic scene, somebody did fall in but didn't die, and that was John Howland, a boy. He was swept under, but there was a line from the ship hanging right there. He grabs the line and hauled back aboard, and 2 million people descend from John Howland. 3 presidents ended up from John Howland's family. That's funny. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, literary figures in American history as well. There's a children's book about him. God placed that line right there, and 2 million people exist today because the line was there, not there. At another point in the voyage, an impossible crisis arose. One of the main beams of the ship cracked, like the ship is falling apart. Miraculously, they have just the tool needed that was probably for a joist hoisting for building once they had to arrive, and they've got this. They got a giant screw, and they repaired it, just barely kept the ship going. So Bradford says, then they committed themselves to the will of God and resolved to proceed. They're not going to turn around over this, such a thing. Again, another good life motto right there, yes? Resolve yourself to proceed and follow the will of God wherever he takes you. In the midst of these crises, Bradford spoke about how there were differences of people on this ship, pilgrims and strangers. And he says, although we had our differences, we are all God's children. That's not the bigotry that you hear about from some of these, papal-ish types of Protestants. This is a beautiful statement of William Bradford. We are all God's children, and as such, we be but specks in this vastness of the ocean, but precious unto our Lord. And now together we are voyagers, pilgrims, and look to thine infinite mercy and providence. Our society today needs that reminder that we may have our differences, but we are all here in this vastness of this ocean as specks, and we can all look to God's providence and recognize we are all created by him. In our stormy seas of our cultural division that we have now, let's recapture that. Well, there was a baby born on the ship en route named Oceanus. Can you imagine being a mother going into labor in these conditions? Unbelievable. But that cry of that newborn baby has got to be emblematic to new life, new freedom, new birth of Protestantism in the new world. I find that beautiful. 9 weeks on the wild autumn Atlantic. Land is overdue now. Oh, we spotted the land. Land ho! Fruitful Virginia is just ahead. Oh, no, wait. This is not Virginia, the captain figures out. Head due south. We've got to go south. But as they're approaching the deadly shoals, because this is New England, they're going to be cast upon the rocks and perish this close to their destination. So he said, we can't go south. The winds are contrary. He says, pray as you never prayed before. And a miraculous wind out of the south pulls them away from the shoals, and they're in deep water and safety. And they anchor out in Provincetown Harbor, interpreting this as God saying, that's where I want you to be, not Virginia. Why? Well, I told you, remember 1617, right? They were led by God's finger pointing them across the ocean. Beginning in 1617 is when they made the decision. And they have to do all their procedures and sell their property and you get the plans. And 1620, they went. But what else was going on in 1617? God knew what was going on in New England in Massachusetts in 1617. There was a plague that had ravaged the most warlike of the native tribes that were inhabiting the exact spot where God ended up putting them with the Mayflower 3 years later. So the warlike tribe is dying off. The Wampanoags, who are going to be the friendly ones to the Pilgrims, are the ones that survive. At the same time as this is happening, God's telling them, yes, go to America. I've got a place for you. This has just happened, and you're gonna find a nice place there because the land's already been cleared. The Wampanoags don't want to be anywhere near with the superstition of the land that had the plague. And now you can have a settlement and find some friends who are going to teach you some things. We'll talk about those friends. This is beautiful because actually, before we get to them, they come aboard, or they come ashore. They get some wood, some juniper to cook. They're down to small rations of food. They've got cornbread, 1/4 pound per person per day is all. And so they're into winter now and starving, literally. And they find a cache of corn that had been dug and hidden by some of the American Indians. And they take it. And we look back and we go, there you go with Western British imperialism again. Here you go with, exploiting. You know what? These guys are different, though. There was a lot of that, especially the Spanish. The British had their moments as well, and the French. But you know what these pilgrims did? They took the corn to save their children's lives, and they said, we're going to pay them back with large satisfaction. When we get established, and it was one of their first order of business, we need to know whose corn we took because we owe them, and we're going to give them even more. They treated these native peoples like actual humans, not subhuman savages. So you got to read actual history. Read Plymouth Plantation. Read into the history, not just what the agenda-driven messages that are coming out there. They're able to survive barely, some of them, on the corn that they found. It wasn't really enough. This is a winter of starvation, scurvy, sickness, and death. And when I say death, we're talking about like every couple of days, another person is dying in this winter. All told, half of the 102 that were on that Mayflower died that winter. Half. And when you calculate the number of mothers that died, there were 18 mothers aboard. 14 mothers died. Why? Why did mothers die at such a higher rate? They were sacrificing for their children, giving them their food. Women are more hardy, actually. They shouldn't be dying at a higher rate. At the historic site in Plymouth, they brag about the fact that they have not one but two memorials to women, which is not very common in historic sites. There's a chapter in the Great Controversy called the Pilgrim Fathers. I like also to honor those mothers, especially this mother. This is a special one. There was a baby born, the first baby born after they reached the New World. The first baby born was named Peregrine White. You want to hear a fun fact? Revelation 12:16 says the earth helps the woman, and then the next verse is the remnant church. The first baby born of the pilgrims when the earth is helping the woman is the great-great-great-great-grandfather of James White. Now, I don't think that's a direct fulfillment of 16 and 17, but it's pretty neat. I find that noteworthy to say the least. That is so cool. The first baby born. We get the leader of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Only 4 families didn't have to bury a family member that winter. The ship captain, after the winter of starvation was over, invited people to give up and come back to England. You know how many of the 51 took him up on it? Not one pilgrim went back to England. Not one. The worldly, the strangers, the ship crew, when they were suffering from the same sicknesses, pilgrims were serving them. They were medical missionaries, especially forgot his name, the one who was their captain. Say it again. No, Bradford was the governor. He'll come up in just a minute. March 26, 1621 was a pivotal day in the survival of Protestantism in America. The pilgrims are gathering in their crudely thrown together meeting house that they had built in the spring there. And a tall Indian pushes the door open and walks right in. And he says, "Hello, Englishman. Me, Samoset." I'm like, what? He speaks English, first of all. Oh, this is providential right here. They feed him, they make friends with him. Samoset. Samoset introduces them to Squanto, introduces them to Massasoit, the chief of the Wampanoag tribe. And Squanto actually was a Christian. He had been converted to Christianity after his tribe, the warlike tribe that was wiped out. He was the sole remaining member. He was enslaved and still somehow saw past the bigotry and evil of this nation of people and saw Jesus Christ because he was objective and fair, and he didn't judge people by the color of the skin, but by the content of their character. Squanto, an admirable man, accepted the gospel and helped these pilgrims out. He didn't say, oh, these are a bunch more slavers like Thomas Hunt, the infamous slave trader who had been in that area. Nope. He lived with the pilgrims, showed them how to catch fish, grow corn with the fish, create compost with it, how to do Three Sisters farming. I mean, this is country living. This is medical missionary work. This is mission work to the Indians, sharing the truth with them. There was one, Winslow was his name, their emissary to the Wampanoags. He would go and sleep right next to the Indians. That was their custom. So you get to sleep right next to Massasoit. And he would introduce them to the gospel and the 10 Commandments. And before they would eat, he would pray. And they asked him why he prayed like that. And he said, well, I'm thanking God, the provider of the food. And they said, we understand there is a provider. There is the Great Spirit, or whatever they called him. And he said, well, let me tell you more about that. And he told them about the 10 Commandments. Isn't that interesting? Now, they didn't get the seventh-day Sabbath yet at that point, but that was yet to come. And so you have the commandments, the country living, you have medical missionary, you have so many beautiful things beginning here with this group. You get this peace treaty that lasted 50 years. You don't find that in the history books. You find King Philip's War that happened with the Puritans 50 years later, and you find how everything was always like this, because maybe there's an agenda to make us do this more. I don't know why they would want that, but it seems like the power elite want to sow strife and division instead of helping people find peace. But they personally went to Massasoit to chief for every land acquisition that the Pilgrims were to get in Plymouth, if it was Wampanoag territory. He would have to personally approve of it, and they would pay for it. So they had a good relationship for decades. There was a drought the very first year. They fasted and prayed. They invited the Indians to fast and pray with them. Rain came, and the natives had said, "This is the best harvest that we've seen in years." And so they had the big Thanksgiving feast. That was the November of 16, or in the fall of 1621. That was memorialized 300 years later during Lincoln's time as American Thanksgiving. But wonderful story of coming together, these Pilgrims and these Native Americans. There was a matter of justice that came up, and that was there was a one of the Wampanoags that was killed by one of the members of Plymouth Colony. And so the Plymouth Colony judge, forgot his name, he was the one that tried the case, and the Wampanoags are like, there's no way we're getting justice, because that's just not going to happen across these racial lines. But he sentenced the two men that had killed the Wampanoag Indian to death by hanging. They were executed for their crime. So that was a matter of justice. But there was another matter of justice that came up, the common store economy. They actually kind of had like socialism. It was anybody could just come and grab what they need, and people were starting to get a little slothful. So Governor Bradford says, we're scrapping the common store system, and we're going to go to land ownership, and you specialize in what you do best and trade. This is 150 years before Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, where you start to understand the division of labor and start to understand market economies as a way to increase productivity. Well, their GDP tripled their GDP. Like, we're happy when we get like 3% GDP growth, right? Their GDP tripled, the gross domestic product, what they were able to produce. No more selfish dependence on the efforts of others. Spirit of Prophecy talks about noble self-reliance. It's a great phrase. The Bible says, if anyone does not work, he shall not eat. And that, of course, does not apply to the infirm, to the elderly, to children. And so, I mean, children should carry their weight, but we care for the needy. That's a Christian principle that this colony believed in as well. But it worked. And that's part of what it says in the Great Controversy about those who came to this land. It's okay to say this. As the tidings spread through the countries of Europe of a land where every man might enjoy the fruit of his own labor. That's not evil greed. That's just how human societies function best. And thousands flock to the shores of the New World. Colonies rapidly multiply. Now, you could get greedy. The devil could use that as an opportunity during times of prosperity to make you a greedy person. Let him not do that. But recognize the value of a society that protects property rights, and the value of that. Now, a much more important reason is in gray. Shall we reveal it? As the tidings spread through the countries of Europe of a land where every man might obey the convictions of his own conscience, thousands flocked to the shores of the New World. Colonies rapidly multiplied. And this was the first of the independent Protestant colonies. The Mayflower cargo it was a cargo ship, and it brought such precious cargo with all these children. But even more important than that, it brought the cargo of principles of liberty, principles that would form the place where prophecy would be fulfilled as the earth helped the woman. So are we willing today to follow where God directs us? To remember that all challenges that come our way need to be answered by equivalent courages. And that when we see people around us who believe differently, behave differently, we recognize them also as children of God, not in the adopted and saved sense, but as God's offspring, worthy of our respect and love and service. These are important lessons from the Pilgrims. We can't possibly sum them all up. We see God's providence through it all. We see God's principles through it all. And may we worship him and know him all the more because we see providence fulfilling prophecy. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for what you've revealed to us in the history, which is his story. It's your story. And it's your story revealing yourself to us. So we love you more, having been through this brief experience of reviewing this history. We see that you involve yourself in the affairs of nations, and we know then you also want to involve yourself in our personal life. So we ask that the trust and the confidence we gain when we see miracle stories, that would connect us to you with deeper personal faith, that we may follow your directives to us in these last days. In Jesus' name, amen.